Explicit content is found in this episode. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the True Crime Fan Club podcast. I'm your host, Lainey. There are very few crimes that have made me sick to my stomach. The nature of telling you these true crime stories is that you often become numb to the facts. You feel immense sympathy for the victims and families, but we can often stomach the details. This case for me was hard to stomach for so many reasons. Maybe after listening, you'll understand why. Okay, on to the show. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25, 1963, in Cumberland, North Carolina, to Joseph E. Duncan Jr. and Lillian Duncan. He was the youngest of 4 children. Growing up, Joseph had the nickname Jet. It is supposedly a shortening of his full name. Joseph's father was in the Army, which meant the family moved every few years. His father retired from the military eventually, and the family settled in Tacoma, Washington. Although reports state that Joseph was born in Tacoma, it has been verified through Ancestry.com records that he was indeed born in Cumberland, North Carolina. Joseph and his older sister Sherry contend that they were regularly beaten by their mother. According to her later trial testimony, she stated, quote, "When she was beating on you, if you fought back, it was worse. In Joseph's case, he just took what she gave him and kind of whimpered off into his bedroom." Their mother was a religious fanatic who seemed to have a grudge against men. She would rant and rave about how worthless they were while she was beating her sons, but it seems she was misdirecting her hatred for her husband on her children. Bruce Duncan, Joseph's older brother, would defend his mother and his childhood by denying any beatings ever took place in their home. The remaining Duncan siblings have remained mum on the issue and have not corroborated either side. At the age of 16, his parents finally divorced. There wasn't much of a shift in the family's dynamic, as their father was rarely home. Joseph, now a sophomore at Lakes High School, opted to drop out of school. He wasted no time getting into trouble. In 1978, at the age of 15, he raped a 9-year-old at gunpoint, a crime for which he was not arrested for. In 1979, he stole a car and was chased and apprehended by local authorities. For this crime, Joseph was sentenced to a few months at Dilson's Boys Ranch in Tacoma, Washington. While serving time at the ranch, Joseph admitted to his therapist that he had already bound and sexually assaulted 6 boys. He also estimated that he had committed 13 rapes. There is no record that the therapist at the ranch did anything other than work with him through his thoughts. In January of 1980, Joseph stole 4 guns and ammunition from a neighbor's house. Next, Joseph would abduct a 14-year-old boy who was walking to school. Joseph made the boy go into the woods where he sexually assaulted him twice while holding him at gunpoint. He also put out cigarettes on his skin. For this crime, he was actually arrested and prosecuted. He pled guilty to first-degree rape, and the judge offered Joseph a choice: attend a sex offender treatment program or spend 20 years in prison. Joseph chose a sex offender treatment program, and while attending the program at Washington State Mental Hospital, Joseph underwent a psychological evaluation. The results showed that Joseph was, quote, preoccupied with deviant sexual fantasies and meets the definition of a sexual psychopath. He was only in the program for less than 2 years when he was kicked out after he was caught sneaking out of the building at night to peep on people. The judge then reinstated the 20-year prison sentence. He was released on parole after 14 and a half years in prison, and he quickly moved out of the Tacoma area and headed towards Seattle in 1994. In August of 1996, Joseph was sent back to prison for 2 parole violations. The first violation occurred after he tested positive for marijuana. The second violation was a result of Joseph being in possession of a firearm. He would only spend 2 months in prison for these offenses. It wouldn't be long before he committed the exact same violations in March of 1997. A warrant was then issued for his arrest. Not wanting to return to prison, he stole his girlfriend's car and left Washington. In August of 1997, he was arrested in Kansas City, Missouri, for violating his parole. He was extradited back to Washington and would be released from prison in July of 2000. Upon his release, he relocated to Fargo, North Dakota, where he was required to register as a Level 3 sex offender. According to criminaljustice.gov, a level 3 sex offender is the highest level of sex offender. They have a high risk of repeat offenses and a threat to public safety exists. They must be registered for life. In the fall of 2000, Joseph enrolled at a computer programming program at North Dakota State University. He was a good student and even made the dean's list. In July of 2004, Joseph molested a 6-year-old boy on the Roosevelt Elementary School playground in Detroit Lakes, Minnesota. He also tried to molest an 8-year-old boy on that same playground, but was unsuccessful. He was charged with the molestation in March of 2005. He was released on a $15,000 bond because he did not have a recent criminal record. Of course, taking this opportunity, Joseph skipped out on the bail. His last contact with police was on April 11th, 2005. On April 15th, Joseph rented a red Jeep, but never returned it. It would later be reported stolen. According to Joseph's Fargo landlord, he was a good tenant up until he moved out, and she discovered that he left his apartment in disarray with writings on a mirror and desk blotter saying, quote, "Sorry you missed me, and without forgiveness, there is only sanity." It is believed that Joseph was still living in Fargo when he molested the 6-year-old boy in Minnesota, and up and left Fargo when he jumped bail. In May of 2005, a warrant was issued for his arrest. Authorities would have no clue as to the atrocities he would commit while on the lam. One family in Coeur D'Alene, Idaho would never be the same once Joseph Duncan came into town. I'm going to pause the case right here so you can hear a word from our sponsor. Brenda K. Groney was born on March 3, 1975, to Darlene and Douglas Matthews in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. At a young age, she expressed interest in needlepoint, gardening, and cooking, hobbies she continued well into her adulthood. She remained in her hometown her entire life, wanting to raise her children in a safe place. In total, she had 5 children. Her 2 eldest children, Jesse and Vance, lived with their father, Steve Groney, full-time. Her remaining 3 children, Slade, Dylan, and Shasta, lived with her and her boyfriend, Mark Edward McKenzie. Brenda was employed as a waitress and was even an entrepreneur. She owned and operated a business called Made to Order, which was fairly successful. Mark McKenzie was born on June 26, 1968, to parents Ralph and Lee McKenzie. Mark had recently asked Brenda to marry him after 7 years of dating, which she happily accepted. He worked at Spokane Stainless Productions and enjoyed hunting in his spare time. The couple enjoyed partying and recreationally used drugs. 13-year-old Slade Vincent Groney was born on March 29, 1992. He was a student at Lakes Middle School and enjoyed hunting, playing video games, and listening to rap music. 9-year-old Dylan James Groney was born on July 16, 1995. He loved playing football, guitar, and being goofy. 8-year-old Shasta Groney was born on November 25, 1996. She loved to paint her nails, listen to pop music, dance, and play with her dolls. Brenda was looking forward to the happy future that awaited her and her family, although it would never come to fruition. In the early hours of May 16, 2005, Joseph broke into the back door of the Groney-McKenzie rural home off Interstate 90 in Wolf Lodge Bay, Idaho, which is east of Coeur d'Alene. Prepared for his mission to kidnap and assault Shasta and Dylan, he was wearing night vision goggles, a mask, a hood, and leather gloves. Everyone in the house was asleep, so first Joseph found Brenda Groney asleep in the living room. He woke her up and pointed the sawed-off shotgun he brought with him in her face. He motioned for her not to scream or make any noise, which she agreed to. He motioned for her to get up and made her take him to each bedroom of the house. When he saw what he was working with, he then took each family member one by one back to the living room and bound their arms and legs with zip ties and duct tape. After binding each person, Joseph took Dylan and Shasta into the backyard and made them lie down in the grass. Joseph then took Slade into the backyard and hit him with a claw hammer until he stopped moving. He then went back inside and killed Brenda and Mark in the living room with the same hammer. Next, Joseph kidnapped Shasta and Dylan. He put them, still bound, on the floor of a truck he had recently stolen. He drove them to where he was keeping the rented red Jeep and moved them there. The Jeep had stolen Missouri plates, and unbeknownst to Joseph, it was reported stolen on May 4th. Like most rural towns, neighbors look out for each other. Robert Hollingsworth knew the family well and noticed the house was rather quiet. When he approached the home, he saw blood on the door and knocked several times, but no one ever came. He then contacted the police and reported his concerns.
There's blood all over the door. Nobody comes to the door.
The police arrived to the scene and realized that there were two family members missing, 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan. They began searching the rural land, but found no trace of either child. This information led police to believe that the children had been abducted. Since they were clearly in immediate danger, an Amber Alert was issued. The community was in complete disbelief. Coeur d'Alene was peaceful and idyllic to the residents. They were panicked and worried that the person who murdered this family would target them next. The father of the children was questioned as a suspect. Brenda and Steve recently argued about custody of the 3 children and communal land. A day or two after their abduction, Steve makes a public plea in front of news cameras.
Please release my children safely. They had nothing to do with any of this.
Investigators notice a red flag in his plea when he says, "Please let my children go safely. They had nothing to do with this." Investigators wonder if Steve knows more than what he's already said. He is called in again for questioning and agrees to take a polygraph. There are some irregularities on his test which cause authorities to seek warrants to search his home and to collect his electronics. Steve maintained that despite their disagreements, he would never murder the mother of his own children, let alone his kids. Upon review of his cell phone records and computer activity, Steve Groney is eliminated as a suspect. There was a fingerprint found at the scene that belonged to Gary Youngwood, who had attended a barbecue at the Groney home a day before the murder. Jesse Groney shared that Gary also owed his mother over $2,000 for a drug debt. They attempted to make contact with Gary, but after contacting his probation officer, they discovered that he notified them he was going to be out of town on vacation. His probation officer requests that he return to Coeur d'Alene immediately, where he willingly speaks to police and submits to a polygraph. He passes his exam and is no longer considered a suspect. As the weeks rolled by, many tips poured in, but they mostly led to dead ends. Authorities knew that they had a limited amount of time to rescue both children. The blood evidence showed that Shasta and Dylan had not been injured in the home, and this gave hope to investigators. Brenda and Mark's blood showed that they had smoked marijuana and smoked meth several hours before the murder. Authorities again looked into the idea that the murders were drug-related, but the disappearance of Dylan and Shasta didn't make sense. It still baffled them. They are back to square one and soon requested the assistance of the FBI. The FBI profilers who specialized in serial killers and child abductors were stumped as well. Meanwhile, Joseph was transporting the children to a campsite in Lolo National Forest near St. Regis, Montana. While at the campsite, Joseph molested both children multiple times. Terrified and in shock, the children had nowhere to run. The abuse and torture they endured that night was only the beginning. A depraved Joseph took 9-year-old Dylan to an abandoned cabin. While in the cabin, Joseph videotaped himself molesting and torturing Dylan. He hung Dylan from a wire noose and beat him. He later showed the video to Shasta. The trio spent several weeks on the run, with Joseph committing so many unspeakable atrocities. It is believed that he spent the entire 7 weeks on the run in Lolo National Forest, possibly only moving the pair around a few times. On July 2, 2005, at around 2 o'clock in the morning, Joseph took Shasta to a Denny's in Coeur d'Alene. The waitress, Amber Dean, was initially oblivious to the little girl and older gentleman at her table, but was concerned that she was out this early in the morning. Shasta's demeanor seemed defeated and tired. She looked so dirty. Amber approached her manager and expressed her concerns. She wondered out loud if the little girl sitting at her table was Shasta Groney. Thankfully, Amber and her manager quickly sprung into action. They asked a few employees to stay at the back door, while Amber worked on delaying Joseph so the manager could call the police. Authorities quickly responded and arrested Joseph Edward Duncan III without incident. When Joseph was taken away, Shasta began to cry. She was scooped up by Amber Dean, who asked her name. She shakily told her, Shasta. Amber hugged her tightly and handed her over to authorities, giving a statement immediately. Shasta was taken to a local hospital where she was evaluated and eventually reunited with her father. Authorities implored Steve to allow them to question Shasta, as Dylan had not yet been recovered. Steve, wanting to find his son, agreed. When Shasta was interviewed by police, they wanted to know what happened to her and her brother Dylan. Shasta told police that Dylan was dead. He had been shot with a sawed-off shotgun at the campsite. She told police that Joseph had accidentally shot Dylan in the stomach, then had to shoot him in the head because Dylan was so badly injured. She said that he walked up to Dylan and shot him point blank in the head, but the gun did not go off. Joseph then reloaded the gun and fatally shot Dylan. He then wrapped Dylan's body in a tarp and burned it in a fire. He also burned any items that had Dylan's blood on them. Joseph put Dylan's ashes in garbage bags and had Shasta help him dump them in a pipe that went into a river. Next, Joseph said there was too much evil at that campsite, so they moved to another one for a few days. While at the new campsite, Joseph told Shasta that she had taught him how to love. Because of this, he had an epiphany and decided to take her back to Coeur D'Alene. Shasta bravely told police many other things, including the multiple molestations which were later verified via the rape kit that was collected the day she was rescued. She told police about the videotape she had to watch of Joseph molesting and torturing Dylan. She told police that Joseph repeatedly threatened to kill them with the hammer he had used to kill their family. Joseph would even pull the bloody hammer out and show it to them. She told police that Joseph was, quote, sometimes nice to us and sometimes really, really mean. Shasta also said that Joseph apologized to them and raved about God and forgiveness. He also told the children to call him Daddy. During her time with him, Joseph told Shasta about other murders he had committed. There will be more on this later. Due to Shasta's detailed and brave interview, police were able to locate Dylan's remains on July 4, 2005. The remains were sent off for testing and were later positively identified. The medical examiner estimated that Dylan was killed on or around June 22, 2005. He was buried on his 10th birthday. 4 weeks after her rescue, Shasta returned to the Montana campground with police and showed them where things had happened. Shasta was then turned over to her father's custody. He later followed up with the press and said despite everything she went through, she is happy to be home and seems to be in good spirits. The investigation into Joseph Duncan was just getting started. After talking with Shasta and learning that Joseph had told her of other murders, authorities started a nationwide review of unsolved missing child cases. Joseph became a suspect in cases for when he was on parole in 1994 and 1997. He also became a suspect in cases for when he was free from prison from 2000 to 2005. Police were able to positively link Joseph to the murders of Anthony Martinez, Semiejo White, and Carmen Cubias. He later confessed to these murders, and police were able to corroborate his confession with evidence found on his computer. When police gained access to his computer files, they found that Joseph had been writing a blog called Blogging the Fifth Nail. His first post was dated January 4, 2004. According to Wired, Duncan launched the blog to document his comings and goings in case he was falsely accused of some crime or another. The first 6 months of entries complained about the challenges of moving through society while wearing the scarlet letter of a registered sex offender. Some of those complaints included keeping a job, finding a girlfriend, dealing with aggressive police. His last blog entry was May 13, 2005. There are several disturbing entries in his blog. One that stood out to me seems to show Joseph defending his sex offender status. The title of the post is called Sex and Mayhem. He states, "Someone told me yesterday that I was different than most other sex offenders because I was only 16 when I committed my crime and have never committed any other sex crime since or before. However, the same person said that adult offenders should be castrated and locked up for life. Well, I hope this person will forgive me for making the following analogy, but I couldn't help but picturing some southern white woman in the late 19th century speaking with a heavy southern drawl to a young black man. Why y'all, inward, are pretty cute till y'all get growed up and all, then you thinks you got some rights or something. I'm sure this was an all too common way of thinking in those days, fully supported by the existing government. My crime was a terrible act committed by a confused young person who did not realize at the time the impact of his actions. While it is tempting to rationalize my actions as a youthful mistake, I have long since taken full responsibility and acknowledged the heinous nature of my actions. Maybe that's what makes me different, but my age was just a quantifying factor, not a qualifying one. I have lived in close quarters with the worst types of sex offenders you can imagine, even killers and extremely violent rapists who would snap the neck of another man to get to his female victim. I heard such a story during a special disclosure at the Western State Hospital Sex Offender Treatment Program. Even baby rapists, the worst, and yet every one of them committed their crimes for the same reason as I. They were not in touch with the impact of what they were doing. In fact, the ability these people have to hurt others so terribly depends directly on their ability to hide from the reality of their actions. The Sex Offender Treatment Program at Western State Hospital focused its attention on getting sex offenders to face that reality. I saw the man who disclosed that he broke a younger man's neck falling on the floor in uncontrolled convulsions of emotional wrath as he faced his demons. The reality of what he was and what he had done. I don't know if he ever offended again, but numerous studies have shown conclusively that once a sex offender, any sex offender, reaches this level of treatment, their chance of reoffending drops below 8%. I would never defend or even suggest what this man did was okay because he cried about it. The important thing here is that he probably won't do it again, even after being released back into society. He was never charged with the assault or rape that he disclosed at the program. That was the type of information that got lost in a fire at the program and never made it to a court of justice. That means he was released. Fortunate for someone, no doubt, that he did cry. Semillejo White and Carmen Cubias were half-sisters by their mother, Margaret. Semillejo was born on December 16, 1984. Her father was Sam White. Carmen was born on January 6, 1987. Her father was Leonel Cubias. The sisters had 5 other siblings. On July 6, 1996, the girls, Semillejo was 11 and Carmen was 9, were abducted by Joseph when they left their Seattle, Washington Crest motel room where the family was staying. The girls were heading across the street to get some food. When they did not come home, their mother searched for an hour and then called police. It is unknown how long the girls were with Joseph or when he killed them by hitting them in the head with a crowbar. Their skeletal remains were found by either a construction worker or a drifter in February of 1998 in the Seattle, Washington suburb called Bothell. Although Joseph later confessed to these murders, he has not been charged as of the airing of this episode. Anthony Michael Martinez was born in Riverside County, California on December 9, 1986, to parents Diana and Ernesto Martinez. On April 4, 1997, 10-year-old Anthony was playing in a neighbor's backyard with his 6-year-old brother Mark when Joseph pulled his vehicle into an alley behind the neighbor's house. Joseph got out of the vehicle and approached the playing children. He showed them a picture of a missing cat and said he would give each child $1 if they helped him look for it. The siblings quickly said no and turned their attention back to their playtime. Then Joseph tried to grab Mark, but Anthony got between the two. Mark fell down and lost a shoe. Joseph then drew a knife and put it to Anthony's head. Joseph put Anthony in his vehicle and took off. Next, Mark started yelling, "A man's got Tony!" Ernesto heard Mark and ran outside. He called 911, then started searching for his son. Anthony's body was found on April 19th in Indio, California, by a forest ranger. Anthony was nude, battered, and bound with duct tape. He had been hit in the head with a large rock and left to die. Police found a partial thumbprint on the duct tape used to bind Anthony. The print was later matched to Joseph, once again corroborating his confession. The first trial was a regular county trial. The first charges Joseph faced were for Brenda, Mark, and Slade. Joseph pled guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping for binding them with duct tape and zip ties on October 16, 2006. Joseph was immediately sentenced to 3 life terms with no chance of parole for the kidnappings. But as a part of his plea deal, Joseph would not be sentenced for the 3 murder charges until after the federal trial for Shasta and Dylan. Following the federal trial, he was sentenced to 3 life terms without the possibility of parole for the murders in November of 2008. The second trial was a federal trial because he transported Shasta and Dylan across state lines. Joseph pled guilty to 10 charges on December 3, 2007. The charges were as follows: the kidnapping of Shasta, the kidnapping resulting in the death of Dylan, sexual exploitation resulting in the death of Dylan, aggravated sexual abuse of both children, a felon in possession of a firearm, using a firearm in a crime of violence resulting in death, transportation of a stolen firearm, processing unregistered firearm, and transportation of a stolen vehicle. 3 of the charges could lead to the death penalty: the kidnapping resulting in the death of Dylan, sexual exploitation resulting in the death of Dylan, and using a firearm in a crime of violence resulting in death. The trial to determine if Joseph should receive life imprisonment or the death penalty began on August 13, 2008. During the trial, Joseph represented himself. Shasta, thankfully, did not have to testify. The jury deliberated for 3 hours before they decided to sentence him to death for all 3 counts. Joseph was then extradited to California in January of 2009 to stand trial for the murder of Anthony Martinez. For the crimes against Anthony, he was charged with kidnapping, molestation, and murder. On March 15, 2011, Joseph pled guilty to all charges in order to avoid the death penalty. On March 5, 2011, Joseph was sentenced to 2 life sentences without parole. During his multiple trials, Joseph told the jurors that he was on a rampage. He was going to kidnap, rape, and murder children over and over again until he died. Joseph had plots to invade daycares, parking lots, campgrounds, and more. He marked target locations on his GPS device. He said, quote, "I was on a rampage. I hated myself and I hated you. I hated everything that you represent. I hated the system. I knew the best way to hurt you was the same way that I was hurt, an eye for an eye. Except that system didn't take my eye. The system took my heart, and it took my innocence. And that's what my intention was to do the same to it." Semenyejo White and Carmen Cubias were his first revenge. The revenge was for his first jail sentence. Anthony Martinez was his revenge against society, again for sending him back to jail for a probation violation. Shasta and Dylan were targeted. He had previously driven by their house and saw them playing outside. That is when he decided to kidnap, torture, and rape them. Joseph is currently in prison at Terre Haute United States Penitentiary in Indiana. He has no execution date scheduled. The lone survivor of Joseph's murderous journey is Shasta Groney. Shasta has spent a lot of time petitioning for Slade and Dylan's law. This law would put convicted sex offenders in prison for life. Shasta's father, Steve, has helped with the petition. She faced a lot of backlash for this request, with many online attackers telling her that people deserve second chances. Unfortunately for Shasta, she has faced many troubles in her life. Some would say she followed in her mother's footsteps by indulging in drugs at a young age. In early 2014, she was sentenced to 12 months in juvenile detention for a drug charge. In 2018, she was sentenced to probation for 2 misdemeanor counts of injury to a child after she left meth next to her 1-year-old and 1-month-old children. She was arrested again for violating her probation and was released on supervised probation. Joseph had one final request of Shasta before he was captured, and that was to visit him in jail. Since June of 2018, Shasta has been planning to write a book about her experience and release a documentary. She hopes to confront her captor and tell him that he is nothing to his face. She is currently engaged and living in Nampa, Idaho, with her fiancé and 2 sons. Okay, fan club members, as I conclude this episode, my one question to you is, How will you sleep tonight? Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to leave us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice. It really does help us out. You can find us on most social media platforms, Twitter @TCFCPod, Facebook.com/TCFCPodcast. You can also find us on Instagram, TCFC_podcast. And of course, our website is truecrimefanclub.com. If you have an episode request, send us an email, tcfcpod@gmail.com. Music for the show is provided by We Talk of Dreams. Check them out on Twitter @WeTalkOfDreams or WeTalkOfDreams.com. Content warning at the top of the show was provided by Tyler Allen, host of the Minds of Madness podcast. Research for this episode was provided by Haley Gray, host of the Murder Road Trip podcast.